White women played an active and forceful role in the slave trade. They bought, sold, managed, and sought the return of enslaved individuals which they considered valuable property. Owning many enslaved people made a woman more attractive for marriage. After getting married, white women often went to court to secure the legal ownership of enslaved people, often winning against their husbands. Yes, that's right. Many people are aware that George Washington owned enslaved individuals at his Mount Vernon residence. However, not as many might realize that his wife, Martha, played a significant role in increasing the number of enslaved people there. When they got married in 1759, George might have owned about 18 people, but Martha, who was quite wealthy, owned 84. And while owning a large number of enslaved individuals like Martha did might seem uncommon, the idea of her owning them is not unusual. What am I trying to say? Historians have estimated that 6 to 7 million enslaved people were imported during the 18th century alone. These slaves had very few rights. It's like how there are rules in many societies to prevent cruelty to animals. Similarly, there were also rules about how much mistreatment a slave could endure. As adults, white women sometimes separated black women from their own babies so that these black women could breastfeed the white mistress's child instead. To make this happen, white women posted lots of ads in newspapers to find enslaved wet nurses to feed their own babies. This created a big market for black women who had recently given birth. White women also fought hard to keep the wealth and unpaid work that slavery brought them, even during the Civil War. As Union soldiers moved through the South to free enslaved people, white women would move these people away from the soldiers' path. One woman named Martha Gibbs took enslaved people to Texas and made them work for her under threat of a gun until 1866, a year after slavery was officially ended. Apart from planting and harvesting, there were many other types of work needed on these farms. Enslaved people had to make new land ready for farming, dig trenches, cut and carry wood, butcher animals, and fix buildings and tools. Sometimes they also worked as skilled workers like mechanics, blacksmiths, drivers, and carpenters. Black women had even more responsibilities like cooking, looking after children, and doing tasks like spinning, weaving, and sewing. But before then, hit that subscribe button and like the video because you don't want to be left out of this. One of the worst things for enslaved people was the constant fear of being sold. Even if their owner seemed kind, slaves knew that if the owner faced money problems or other troubles, they could be sold. Sometimes, slaves were sold as punishment too. Even though it was often encouraged to keep families together, it didn't always happen. Families were often split apart. Even if some family members were kept together, they would be taken away from their other relatives like grandparents, siblings, and cousins. This meant they might never see each other again. The fear of being sold was always there, even if it never happened. African American women had a really hard time because they were often sexually exploited by their female owners. There were no rules to protect them from being treated inappropriately, harassed, or even raped by their owners or overseers. This mistreatment was common, as the men in power took advantage of their position. Even if a woman seemed to agree, she had no choice. Enslaved men couldn't do much to protect the women they cared about from this abuse. Even if a woman seemed to agree, she had no choice. Enslaved men couldn't do much to protect the women they cared about from this abuse. Unsurprisingly, slaves had to endure not only physical harm, but also sexual harm. They were often bothered, forced into relationships, or even raped by mostly white slave owners and overseers. Enslaved women were made to do things with their bodies that they didn't want to by the people who owned them. However, this mistreatment wasn't only about women. There is a long history of black men facing sexual harm too. but this issue is mostly left out of the news and history books. Still, many experts have looked into it and found lots of cases where enslaved men and boys were raped or sexually hurt. Female slave owners in the American antebellum South used sexual assault to control, strip away dignity, and weaken male slaves. The harsh treatment and brutality of chattel slavery are well known, along with the sexual assault that female slaves suffered. While many accounts from slaves and their journals talk about women being raped and sexually harmed, the suffering of male slaves in this way has not been paid much attention to. Sexual abuse was more about showing power and control than about actual intimacy. Physical punishments were ways of showing power that also meant sexual violence for enslaved men. Even though many slaves tried to fight back and resist, it often ended badly. Also, old records and letters from the 1800s show that white women, not just men, used their power to do harmful things. In the book Rethinking Rufus: Sexual Violations of Enslaved Men, historian Thomas Foster carefully looked at how slavery led to sexual violence against both enslaved men and women. Foster studied sexual violence, physical attacks, and forced reproduction using various sources like old American newspapers, journals from slave owners, records from court, and even artwork. One type of sexual violence was the traumatic forced reproduction, where enslaved men and women were made to have children so that there would be more enslaved people. Those who could have many children were often picked out from their communities and moved to other areas. There, they were made to be with multiple partners. The owners allowed these men to avoid certain hard tasks because they worried it might harm their ability to have children. But it's harder to find proof of male slaves being sexually abused compared to females, so this issue hasn't been looked at much. Also, our society usually thinks of rape as happening to certain genders, and this makes both the people who suffer from it and the ones who do it not want to talk about it when it happens to men. There's painful history of black men and women being sexually abused and used during slavery, but this part of history hasn't been talked about much. Even though stories of sexual assault have been passed down through talking and traditions, historians haven't fully studied them. And although sexual violence against male slaves is usually overlooked, did you know that the stories of enslaved men and their untold struggles are just as compelling as those of enslaved women? But here's the twist. Can you guess the intriguing question that lingers? What do you think might have happened if these unheard stories had been told sooner? And how might our understanding of history change if we listen to the once hushed voices? Share your thoughts in the comment sections to keep the conversation